Hi, I'm Stephanie McKeith, certified holistic cancer coach and cannabis educator slash consultant. I am going to share my interview with David Krantz, and I can't wait to explain to you and to actually share with you what an epigenetics health coach is. He, through testing, is able to analyze your DNA so he can help you reach peak and optimal health as quickly and as efficiently as possible. No fads, no trying out different diets, particular nutritional protocols or habits, or anything that could be an epigenetic factor. No guesswork. He takes all of the guesswork out and is able to help you develop an individualized, unique approach to health specific to you. This is a two-part interview, and I can't wait to share both of them with you. So, most people are under the impression that they just get a bad deck of cards when they get a cancer diagnosis. And by bad deck of cards, I mean genetically speaking, bad deck of cards. We were under the impression, kind of, about a little over 10 years ago now, when my dad got his cancer diagnosis. Well, my grandpa had it, my uncles had it, so it must be in the genes somewhere. And until I really got into diving into the research and exploring this other side of integrative and complementary and alternative, not just cancer support and cancer treatment, but health as a whole, that really opened my eyes to epigenetics and how it's not talked about enough. It's not understood. The only reason my kids know about it is because it's stuff that we talk about. Um, how important is it something that people need to know about? Do they need to know about epigenetics or their genes or either one in relation to especially cancer, but health in general?
That's such a great question. And by the way, I'm so glad you're talking with your kids about this and instilling this understanding from a young age because it is so important to really understand what this gene environment epigenetic interaction is about. And um, when I was in high school biology class, we learned your genes code for proteins, which code for traits. And that was the central dogma of biology for many, many years. After we discovered DNA and the structure of DNA in the 50s, that's what was known. And it's partially true. And the reason I say partially true is that beginning in the early 80s, scientists started to discover that there was this other missing piece that they hadn't seen before then. And this is called epigenetics, meaning that these genes are not necessarily set in stone. They actually can change their expression over time in response to the environment. And I use the word environment very loosely to mean
Mm-hmm.
pretty much every signal that the body gets: food, light, stress. All of these things that we're encountering on a daily basis actually go into changing the way that our genes are expressed. And so, yes, there are certain gene variants or differences in the letters of the code of the DNA that can create predispositions, create propensities, create likelihoods for cancer or other diseases. But it's really the environmental factors that trigger those things, that turn those genes on, turn them off. And there's almost no gene in the human body, very rare. There's some truly ingrained genetic mutations, but that's a very low percentage of what's happening. Most genes that people refer to cancer genes and refer to as cancer genes are really working from this idea that yes, certain variants might have higher likelihood, but then in the presence of, say, a poor diet, little exercise, high stress, poor circadian rhythm, that is what turns those genes on from having some risk to really expressing fully. But what's really empowering and really amazing is that you can take that information and use it kind of in the opposite direction to say, all right, well, what are the things we know that can create protective factors? What are the things that can actually change expression of genes that are anti inflammatory, that are health promoting? And there's tons of evidence that most of what we consider to be healthy habits, things like exercise, things like nutrition, are really operating primarily at the epigenetic level and changing gene expression, turning on genes, turning off genes. And that may seem kind of like this foreign, esoteric, difficult to
Yeah.
understand idea, um, but it's tied into the way we feel on a daily basis. It's tied into the way that diseases show up or don't. It's like if you think about, okay, a disease has a biochemical component, right? That's kind of what it's describing. It's describing an abnormality in the way your body is firing, the way that it's creating different chemicals. And each one of those chemicals, each one of those enzymes or proteins or hormones has a gene that's associated with it. And when that gene changes expression, you might cause a certain chemical in your body, a certain enzyme, to be increased or decreased. And the body is really smart. It's trying to adapt the best it can
Mm-hmm.
to the environment, and that's one of the big things to keep in mind. The body is always trying to do what it wants to do, which is maintain a balance. But if we're not giving our body the things that create that balance, we're inherently going to increase risk factors that we might be born with, and we're going to decrease the protective factors. But again, on the flip side, if we understand which particular gene variants we have and what practices might go into reinforcing the protective factors and decreasing the risk factors, that's the recipe for creating proactive health.
So you said back in the 80s is when we really discovered epigenetics. So is that not part of medical curriculum today? Is that why we're not, why this isn't talked about in every oncologist's office, at every doctor's appointment? Is this something not recognized by the entire system? Why are we talking about this? And most people that watch this are gonna kind of wonder what kind of language we're speaking here.
Right. So I say it was discovered in the
Yeah.
80s, the beginnings of it. But it's really been the past 10 to 15 years where there's been a massive increase in research on this. And it's really important to distinguish between research and medical practice
Yeah.
and what's being taught in medical schools and how long it takes for something that is truly cutting edge in the research field to make its way into the consciousness of people that are treating patients. And any cancer researcher you talk to, anyone that's involved in the hard science of this knows that cancer is a epigenetic disease. It's a interaction of genes and the environment, and most doctors know that too. They just might not necessarily um, speak the language as fluently. And same thing with any doctor that's working with any health condition. Diabetes, heart disease. All these things have epigenetic components to them, and there are certain practitioners out there, people that have trained in the same method that I do,
Yeah.
that operate from this mentality to look at, all right, what are all of these different inputs that are actually working on the epigenetic level? And it's just really powerful because you're getting to the root layer that all of these other things sit on top of. And it allows us to get in there a little bit more precisely, and we can talk a little bit more about why this is good for individualizing approaches
Mm-hmm.
for people based on their genes. And it's going to be what people talk about in doctors' offices in 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. People have the opportunity now to take advantage of this if they know where to look And I really appreciate you having me on here and giving your listeners the opportunity to understand this information and look at it from the perspective of having a little bit more control and opportunity to change things. Like you said initially, the idea that you're going to receive the health that your parents received and their grandparents received, yes, there's likelihoods of that, but there are also things that you can do to radically change the outcome. And let me give you an example of this. There's because I find it's very helpful to look at the concrete examples. We can talk about the abstract, but when we get
Right.
narrowly focused, it really just makes a lot more sense. So there's a gene called APOE, that is one of the most well-researched genes when it comes to Alzheimer's and cognitive decline.
Mm-hmm.
And there's about 20 to 25% of the population that carry a variant of this called the APOE4 variant. And people with an APOE4 variant tend to have an elevated risk of those diseases, also cardiovascular disease. And what this gene does is it codes for a protein that transports fats in the body. And fats are very important for the development of healthy linings of cells. They're important for the development of endothelial tissue, the linings of your blood vessels. But it's also very important in terms of how your body creates inflammation. And what they found is people with these ApoE4 variants are much more prone to inflammation, but
Mm-hmm.
particularly when they're eating diets that are high in saturated fat. The saturated fat turns on the expression of this gene in a negative way. And what they found is that when people with this ApoE4 variant reduce their dietary intake of saturated fat, their disease risk for those things basically becomes normalized, basically becomes the exact same as someone with the ApoE3 variant who has kind of the average risk factor. And so that's an example of the gene environment interaction where, okay, there's a gene with a certain risk factor or propensity, but it's really what you're putting into your body, what the environmental input is, that is really changing the outcome of that. And so that's something that if you know you have that gene, you can be proactive about it and reduce the inflammation in your body by changing what you're putting into it. Another example of this is a gene called SOD2 that is a antioxidant that's involved in the mitochondrial production of energy. So mitochondria are the parts of our cells that produce energy for the rest of the cell to use. It's super important. And there's more and more research now that dysfunctional mitochondria can contribute to cancer and
Mm-hmm.
contribute to the signaling pathway that causes cancer to develop. And cancer cells will hijack mitochondria and actually
Mm-hmm.
use them for their own
Right.
um, uses, right? Um, but there's this gene called SOD2 that makes this really important antioxidant enzyme that kind of cleans up the waste product in the energy production cycle. Like if you imagine energy production, think about a power plant. There's going to be things that are going to be released that is not the ideal end product. There's a byproduct. And so this enzyme kind of sits there and just cleans up the byproduct, ideally. Uh, there's certain people who have a variant, and I actually have this variant, that produce about 40% less of this enzyme. And so you can
Ah,
imagine what happens with the energy production systems
right.
in the body and the buildup of that waste product.
Right.
And there are a number of studies out there that show that that variant is implicated in higher risk of certain types of cancer, prostate cancer, and other diseases. But there are lots of things that you can do to actually increase the production epigenetically of that enzyme. There are certain substances that will say to that gene, hey, make more of this enzyme. And so if you have a variant like that, you can take certain supplements, do certain things that promote the production of that. Or there's also ways to just get SOD, this enzyme, it's called superoxide dismutase,
Hmm.
from food sources.
Hmm.
Chaga mushroom is a really good example of that. And I'll give you just my own story on that. The first time I ever tried chaga tea, I felt like I was just like lit up, like
Yeah.
on top of the world all of a sudden. And my partner tried it at the same time, and she didn't really feel anything from it. I was like, "Are you serious? I feel amazing right now. Like I have all this energy, feel so good." And it wasn't until I looked at both of our genes and discovered that, well, I have the variant that causes me to naturally make, 40% less of this enzyme. She's one of the people that naturally makes more of it. And so for me, it was like going from, a 2 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
And for her, it was probably going from like an 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10
Right.
to a 10 out of 10. And it didn't make that much of a difference. But for me, it was this huge jump in this enzyme that increases the clean energy production capacity in the body. So, those are just two examples that might be relevant to your audience. And, that kind of brings us into understanding what gene variants you have can actually influence how you live your life, how you eat certain foods, take certain supplements to modify the risk factors that you have and bolster the protective factors that you have really specific to your body.
Right. So to expand on the example that you gave, I'm going to use my dad, for instance. This was the tip for me in as far as learning and exploring and understanding what this whole alternative world means. So then by the time my sister was diagnosed, the one of the first questions was, all right, who in your family has cancer? Dad, grandpa, grandma, uncles, aunts. Oh, okay, that's, well, there we have it. There's your answer. It runs in your family. You were more susceptible to it. Here's your reason for your cancer diagnosis. So now my dad, we didn't understand at the time. I was learning along the way. So during his 4-year journey with cancer, it was a big learning curve for me. Is as far as epigenetics go. So I didn't really have opportunity to apply. It was more random. It was, these are some things that are showing promising as far as supplements and treatments and therapies. So we kind of just threw things at him to see what would stick and what wouldn't stick, what worked, what didn't work. For my sister, everything was very specific. She sought holistic treatment. She was very individualized in her treatment. She actually went to Mexico for her treatment. So very different outcomes. She's thriving. She is cancer free. She is a completely, they're come from the same family genetic pool, completely different outcomes. So what a lot of people want to know is, could I just get a really bad deck of cards? So under 20%, right, is genetically linked to cancer?
I'm not sure what the actual balance is, and I think
Okay.
it depends on, um, it depends probably on the specific type of cancer. But I'm pretty confident in saying that there is always a balance
Yeah.
between the environment and the deck of cards that you've gotten. And, I'll say my area of expertise is more in prevention, more in
Mhm.
what are the things that you can do on a regular basis to bolster your defenses. And I think what you're describing in terms of really seeing different outcomes by getting the custom tailored precision approach speaks volumes for taking that same approach ahead of time, just with what you're doing in your daily life to really give yourself the best opportunity to do things what's right for your body. Um, and I'll kind of give you another example with it, and this is something I see a lot in my clients around estrogen metabolism
Mhm.
and propensity for certain types of breast cancer. And there is a pretty wide range of metabolic differences between people and how they break down estrogen. So, especially women, as you ovulate and go into your period, you break down estrogens that, you go from high estrogen to low estrogen. And there's different pathways in the body, specifically these liver enzymes that break down estrogen. And there's certain estrogen kind of byproducts. And some are health promoting, some are actually good for DNA repair and really positive to have. And then if they're shunted down a different pathway, they can actually be toxic to DNA and are associated with higher breast cancer risk. And this is something that you can look at with your genes. And it's not a diagnostic thing. It's not saying you're going to get breast cancer. It's going to say, hey, here are the systems in the body that we know that you can modify if you, say, have a estrogen metabolism that predisposes you to create more of these toxic metabolites. Here are some substances that you could potentially use to modify that gene expression and send estrogen down a different pathway. And so it's not just about saying, hey, you've got this propensity. It's about looking at it from a systems approach, right? It's about looking at how all of these different pathways in the body that break down substances or process different nutrients, how these things are actually interacting and contributing to this overall picture of health, and learning what are kind of the liabilities that you might have. What are the things that are naturally protective? Can we reinforce those? And like with the estrogen metabolism, it's generally a pretty simple thing. It's cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, contain this compound called diindolylmethane or DIM that will actually epigenetically change the expression of these enzymes that break down estrogen. And so it will send estrogen down a different pathway into the non-toxic protective one, and prevent it from going down the more toxic one. And for certain clients, if they've had a family history of breast cancer, well, then they might want to actually do the extracted form, like actually do a supplement of it because
Right.
it's more concentrated.
Right.
Um, and so it is kind of like what you're saying, like looking at family history and matching it with what might be going on from a systems approach, from a complex systems thinking approach in the body, and kind of not just stopping at the family history, but moving further into the, well, what can we really learn about these systems that create that propensity, and then what can we do to change it?
So when we see two people with a cancer diagnosis, and one of them's working, I mean, they're both doing all the things, all of the organic, clean eating, juicing, all of their therapies, going through all the detoxification methods, taking all of these extra measures and steps into integrative treatments and therapies, and one person does really well and recovers, and the other one just struggles day in and day out. Are these random interactions with epigenetics, would you say?
I would say most likely, and I'll say that a lot of what I'm talking about is more about the nuclear genome, or the genome that is kind of present in all of your cells. And the cancer genome is kind of a different animal
Yeah.
in terms of um, the mutated code that cancer creates. And there is so much variability in that, and that's a whole area that is a pretty hot topic and an important topic in terms of cataloging the DNA and the specific mutations that are present in different tumor types, and developing different treatments based on that. And so that's kind of separate from looking at what genes you've been dealt with, right? What
Yeah.
the deck of cards are.
Yeah.
This is like a second deck of cards that the bad deck of cards plus the G environment interaction just dealt you again.
Yeah.
And so it's like, um, from the perspective of looking at two people that might be having different responses with an active cancer diagnosis, yes, there's probably a difference in the epigenetics of that particular mutation and that particular type for that person.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Um, I focus with my clients on the approach of supporting the whole being. We don't talk a lot about the cancer. That's for the doctor, that's for their treatment protocol, which I don't get into. I am looking to give them all of the information and resources to understand their body, their mind, the connections of the mind to the body, and how they can support their health and well being as a whole.
Yes.
So, the nuclear genome is that focusing on that, can that be